the Medical AI Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Medical AI Podcast, a 30-minute thrill ride of big ideas. I'm Dr. Felix Beecher and I discuss with scientists, innovators and philosophers. One of the landmarks in AI was the work on neural networks in the 1970s by Geoffrey Hinton, the Godfather of AI. This work took place at the University of Edinburgh, and it laid much of the groundwork for the plethora of modern AI-based applications. So academia and the corporate sector are two very different but essential types of crucible for AI research. But what is the relationship between them? Is it a loving partnership, or is it more like a Hollywood marriage with crockery regularly being thrown against the wall? Well, with me to explore this important but very much under-discussed area is Prof Shai Shen-Orr, Associate Professor at Technion, the Israel Institute of Technology. Shai, a very, very warm welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Felix. Pleasure to be here.
Great. All right. Well, look, Shai, could you just introduce yourself?
Sure. So I guess faculty member at the Technion. My background, I kind of grew up originally in AI and machine learning, information systems, and then really by hapstance discovered biology and fell in love with it. Ended up doing a lot of work in the field of systems immunology or systems biology, originally in working with E. coli, C. elegans, model organisms, and then realizing that the humans merit studying. We deserve it, I think. And so my lab's been focused on really studying the immune system and immune-based precision medicine. This really involves both kind of measuring your immune system at high resolution, which is really a high-dimensional data, as well as developing novel algorithms to kind of really get the bang for the buck. And from this, I've gotten the pleasure of both co-directing our AI Institute at the Technion and particularly focused on the biomedical side, where I direct the Zimin Institute, which is all about bringing this to, the academic innovation to ultimately impacting the real world. And with this, I decided to also do it myself. And so I co-founded Cytoreason, which is a pharma AI company, and currently works on modeling computational disease models and a lot of AI in the background of that, and making sure drug development is more accurate. So
okay, fine. So you're eminently qualified to answer this question about the relationship between medical AI innovation in the corporate sector and medical AI innovation in academia. And there aren't that many people who have that kind of qualification. So let's just start at a very basic question. Why is this general question important to be clear on?
On the relationship between the academia and the corporate side?
Yes, the differences and the relationships, yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think it's actually a fascinating and important question because, traditionally, innovation resided in academia. And whatever was done in academia was very disconnected from what was happening in corporate. In fact, especially if you looked at the medical sector, we were doing very basic stuff in academia, and the medical sector, was much more on the applied side. And what has happened, at least in the fields I'm in, where genomics has come in, and you can do so much now in academia, a lot of the innovation is kind of and academia is ahead in many of these kind of components of looking at of medicine and biology, particularly. But it's still distant from how does you make it a real world impact? And so, I see this new, I guess, the 21st century as a place where academia and industry need to be way closer. And therefore, it's really important to understand the balance between them. This is true in medicine and medical AI. It's also true, I think, in other industries as well, but particularly in medicine. And we can talk a bit about that today, I hope.
Okay, so before we dive deeply into the details, could you just describe overall how the relationship between academia and the corporate sector work in terms of this field?
So I mean, it's interesting, right? Because medical AI is has two words, medical and AI, and I would actually, I would like to expand it to call it biomedical AI, right? So there's certainly a lot of the biomedical directions and biology in particular that happen a lot in academia, many discoveries and so forth, and they leverage some level of AI to do so. But they're far from an application. And there's a lot of power players in industry who, particularly in the sides of the medical side of things, who are trying to transform the industry using novel approaches and ultimately, yield something that makes a better output, yields better patient outcomes, or some kind of better utility of AI of the healthcare industry. These two are quite distinct from one another. So really, it's about making the connection between them and thinking when I look at any new grand idea, how much of it needs to be done in academia, how much of it needs to be done in industry, and how do you make sure that the two connect well, so that ultimately you get efficient translation.
Okay, well, what we could do is compare the two sectors by going into some details on the corporate sector first, and then let's talk about academia. So when it comes to the corporate sector and medical AI, could you maybe just take us through some pros and cons, and then we can talk about some specific examples?
Sure. So I think the corporate sector basically faces the problem that it needs to deliver fast something that's ultimately profitable. It needs a business model, right? And then the question is, and it's particularly kind of thinking about this podcast, I was thinking about the difference between the bio and the medical. The problem is, how quickly can you ultimately build a business model here, and that ultimately relates to regulators and payers in many of these applications. And the answer is these move slow. So that becomes a problem for a corporate sector who's developing things that are still, who may still be in the discovery stages. And it's unclear how quickly the regulator will actually transition, because they're still struggling with this. And I think that's a huge negative for the corporate sector. The other side of this is it ultimately yields, a problem with innovation in many places, because it's not only about emulating the physician. It may also be about making new discoveries, and again, there's not enough runway to do them.
So, could you give some examples that illustrate those points?
Sure. Several of those I would take. So one direction is what we would call now precision medicine, right? So, we all want better, precise medicine, better outpatients and so forth. Ultimately, this often relies on, is going to imply that you need to measure new things on patients. So rather than just taking what's existing today in your electronic medical records, you need to be putting whether it's information that's coming from wearables or new biomarkers, new diagnostics, and so forth into the healthcare industry and get that level of reimbursement. That process of finding those diagnostics, developing them, getting the clinician buy-in, getting the payer buy-in, and the regulator, and so forth. That's a long process, and I think companies like Verily, which have kind of started things like Project Baseline, have been struggling with this. In other directions, or Tempus or others like those. Other directions could be places like therapeutics, right? So a lot of the pharma AI space is about basically making discoveries in biology or in chemistry. Designing new discovering new targets, or designing new molecules using AI. Amazing capabilities that exist there, but it takes a village to develop a drug, and ultimately the AI. There's still more error in these fields than there is successes, and companies such as Celsius Therapeutics, Benevolent AI, Excentia have all been struggling with the fact that yes, AI has been helpful, But, well, does it yield such a difference in my ultimate outcome of a clinical trial that it would allow me to build a business model based on, AI, an AI model that drives this kind of these new molecules? And that's another example. And I have others, so we could. Does that make
Sure.
sense?
Yeah, and I also kind of wonder whether, there are certain examples which might make people sit up in horror, where where the corporate sector might commandeer discoveries which people might think of as being belonging to the human race. A good
Yes.
example of that is the Human Genome Product, the
Mm-hmm.
Human Genome Project, which was a subject of quite a lot of controversy to do with copyright. Or
Mm-hmm.
could you talk about that, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a wonderful example. So, when the genome was first sequenced, patent law basically did not allow people to patent genes, right? And you had companies who, there's a famous case of, patenting BRCA1, which is the breast cancer gene. Mutations in that, every time you sequenced it and did a diagnostic, a company had to, was reimbursed on this. And that's a discovery that maybe possibly should belong to the human race, as you said, that is suddenly being used because the project was open, because the ethics of this were not were not well defined. I'd like to hope we're in a slightly better place than we were 20 years ago when that happened. But I think we're not, though we've learned a lot, we're still not in a perfect place, because there's the amount of new discoveries and new data types that exist and so forth are such that ultimately the regulators and the people thinking about the ethics of this and how you protect the personal, an individual on the insurance side, all of those are lagging behind the pace by which biology is being discovered and AI is being applied for those to, AI has really accelerated it and made it even worse. So non-trivial.
Do you think there's also the possibility that AI tools, which could, of course, have really profound benefits for healthcare, could become increasingly concentrated in the hands of big companies? And is that necessarily a good thing, or is it necessarily a bad thing? What are the downsides of that kind of phenomenon?
It's a wonderful question. I think we see evidence now that AI is being concentrated in the hands of very few companies. But what maybe I'll refine that statement. I'll say what is being concentrated in a few companies is AI technology. Then you get this layer of adaptation or kind of leveraging of AI for a particular domain. And that requires domain expertise that many of the technology companies do not have. And I think we're seeing partnerships there between technology developers and those various domain specific expertise to ultimately yield outcome. Because in many ways, we've all been through the LLM revolution, I guess, that's hit us in the past few years. We see the impact of AI there, but what's its been an impact on astrophysics, right? As an example, or on drug development. It has helped a lot, but ultimately there's a lot of other data that is needed and a lot of domain expertise that isn't as rich as we have information for language. And so your standard transformer-based models and so forth don't work for them. And so I think that it yields some hope that you're going to get the technology layers, the NVIDIAs, the Amazons of the world supporting a lot. There are very few such companies, the open AIs, right? But then when it comes to really bringing value, as in healthcare, as in the payer will pay you money because you're improving a patient, that's going to be, I think, in many more companies' hands than the actual AI tool. So there's the layer that gives you the value and is using AI, almost like yet another tool, a pipette, if you like, right? I think that's going to be still with a lot of companies because those processes take a lot of time, and then therefore every company can only focus on some.
Okay, well, let's turn to
Give you
academia.
hope.
Yeah, well, it's always nice to have hope. So let's turn to academia then. I said in my introduction that, I mentioned the case of Geoffrey Hinton, who developed the or at least developed some of the groundwork for neural networks in the 70s based in a university. Now, could you just unpack this for us? How does academia, in what ways can academia act in ways that the corporate sector cannot?
I think it's a wonderful question. So it really goes back to it's the opposite on the negatives, right? So in academia, really, there's many examples. You can take forever to develop something. It can be a pie in the sky, and there's no pressure to do it. I mean, obviously, there's maybe publishing pressures, but one could circumvent those and take the time to do discoveries that basically are too early stage. If we talk about what's called the technology readiness level, TLR. So let's talk in the, usually they start from TLR 1 and so forth. I'm going to talk in the negative, right? TLR -5. Very broad ideas, difficult to fathom, where if you start trying to put them in corporate, when it's blue sky and everything's great, yeah, you can do that. Suddenly the company stock hits, rock bottom, and whoops, we that's the first thing we let go. And that doesn't happen in academia. People with passion for particular directions that may be very far off can continue to develop them generally. And I think, we see those successes. And certainly, Geoffrey Hinton was one example of that, I think. Also, generally, there's a lot of those in biology, in fact.
So what's your position in Cyto-Reason, by the way, Shai?
So I'm the chief scientist of Cyto-Reason, and I'm one of the co-founders of the company. Basically, the company rolled out of my lab. And that's actually another example of something where, if I were to try to roll this company out, day one, I'll say, with nothing at hand, I'll try to form a company that does what Cyto-Reason does, and I'll talk about it a bit later maybe. That would have been very difficult, but it did not. It rolled off from my lab with 10 years of valuable kind of know-how and algorithms and so forth that allow us to, rather than start from scratch, build an integration framework that already is building on something that's been developed.
So
that's another example.
Could you just, I'm sure it's a very interesting story. Could you just tell us that story of how you developed from an academic lab into a company?
Sure. Ultimately, it's what drives us. So I kind of mentioned shifting from studying bacteria, E. coli, to C. elegans to human. Really, for me, that shift was driven by a feeling of, in some sense, gratitude and privilege of being able to do academic level research and the freedom of doing so, and yet feeling that ultimately you owe something to the world. You owe to make that impact. And I sensed that on a personal level when I was doing my PhD at Harvard, and my father was diagnosed with B-cell lymphoma, and I looked at, I was studying the worm C. elegans. I looked at what we know about the worm and what we knew about the human immune system and B-cell lymphomas and so forth, and I was shocked because I knew I had the entire worm's genome sequence. I got all the genes. I knew a lot about it, and when I looked at my father's test result, I was like, what? This is all they test? And to me, that really kind of drove me into human research. And when I went there, what I realized is that we are in this space. And actually, I guess I started doing research back in the early 2000s when the genome was being sequenced, that data is exploding exponentially. So we got a huge amount of data. It sounds like amazing potential, and yet the pace in which we move, the pace in which we make the discoveries, the pace in which we actually bring value to patients is very slow. And I realized that a lot of it has to do with, we keep getting new and better ways of sequencing and cheaper, but we're not investing in how do we develop analytics or in AI solutions that ultimately take that data and bring out value from it. And so started as an academic. I thought, I'll devote 30% of my lab to doing applications. And at some point, you play with it and you do some application stuff. You realize two things. There's only so much you can do in academia. That's the negative. You cannot grow it. You cannot bring really, people with, higher salaries, people with strong skills that they've built over years because, you're sitting in academia. It's a whole different mindset. And on one hand, and on the other hand, you're ready to actually engage more seriously, and it takes more than academic to make an impact in the world. It takes a lot of other kind of multidisciplinary skills. So Cytoreason formed out of that. Basically took all the different algorithmic approaches we developed in the lab, all focused around really understanding the human immune system and high resolution, getting bang for the buck, if you like, from the data that's out there in the human immune system, and developing a state-of-the-art platform solution that makes sure that we get get faster and more accurate understanding of disease biology and how we can think about drug development in that space so that we tailor the right drug to the right patient at the right time.
And so you started off as an academic and then you moved into the corporate sector. You started off with applying for grant funding, presumably, and then ended up applying for funding directly through a pharmaceutical company. Is that correct?
So not in full. I started as an academic, and I'm still an academic. But the company in many ways is an extension of my research. You can think about my lab as being an incubator for really wild ideas that are way, too soon to try to convince any investor or CEO to put, stuff in. We develop, and there's a company called Cytoreason that actually takes those more mature ideas and makes sure that they're now scaled and refined and made improved better beyond whatever paper we publish, and they're applied on in the pharma world. And Cytoreason, it's such a different thing than what people normally do. Kind of the way we there was no, we were talking about business models before. When I started Cytoreason, the idea of a business model of an AI company in the pharma space that does not develop drugs did not exist. Right? Like you can make some IT software, but that's not really a significant success. And what we did is we were revenue funded for 3 years, getting service here, working with pharma here, and so forth, until it was enough to show that there is an opportunity here for an alternative business model than the standard one. And that relates to what I said about the corporate negatives, right? I mean, if I had to yield to the original business, I basically found a way to circumvent the problem that corporates, the corporate culture needs a business model early, which I kind of mentioned before. Does that make sense? Or?
Sure, absolutely. Okay, so when we're thinking about the kind of the kind of relationship between the corporate sector and academia, could you sort of sum up your impression of how functional that relationship is? Or do you think that changes are needed? And if so, what kind of changes do you think those would be?
Yes, that's a wonderful question. I think that that relationship needs major overall. and the reason is because in many ways, up until recently, academia was sitting on some pedestal, which was in many ways very far enough from corporate that academics didn't really need to engage corporate to do things.
Yeah.
And corporates possibly never needed the stuff from academia, right? But as I mentioned, at least in the biomedical side, I think academics are actually generating some of the hottest, coolest data out there on one hand, and on the other hand, they're very far from an application. So the way you move forward there, and the way I see this revised, is a way closer relationship between academics and industry.
And do you think is that direction of change happening already or not?
It certainly is happening in my university, the Technion. We're a technical university, and we recognize that to actually come up with right discovery solutions to hone them, you need to almost rub against industry. You need to understand the needs. You need to understand the use cases. That way, you develop better. You're more targeted towards the right solutions. And you understand, the true needs in the real world. I think, often academics can be somewhat detached. They were never selected for understanding the real world as much as they were good scientists or engineers and so forth. Yeah.
So if there are policy makers listening in, what kind of recommendations would you give to them to try and effect this kind of change?
I would say if you look at it from a public, from the benefit ultimately of the taxpayer needs to find ways in which the technology transfer between academia and industry is facilitated much more better. Basically that you get less failure of things that are not transferred. So it needs to be better, faster, more enabling about ultimately the end goal of improving public health than it is about necessarily university making money off of that.
I see. Okay. So Shai, it's been a fascinating discussion. Typically, the last question I ask of my guests is, what's your favorite example of medical AI is that's got nothing to do with what you have worked on yourself? Would you like to have a go at that question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's funny, I have a lot, but if I had to pick one in the revolution of, that on the space, I guess on the borders of where I work on, so it would be legit for your question. I would put the revolution of basically cell-free DNA for cancer diagnostics. This is really a data-driven AI problem. Companies like Guardant Health, I think, in colon cancer as an example, are making huge changes there for, how we think about cancer and really kind of early diagnosis of it. So I think generally the field of liquid biopsies has been an amazing place that, I never saw it happening when it started. So I couldn't foresee it.
Could you explain what a liquid biopsy is briefly?
Sure. So it basically takes taking a blood sample or a urine sample and so forth. Most of the headway has been around blood and looking for some traces of what would call a diagnostic biomarker. So something that would allow you to identify disease from early, particular types of cancer. It's some kind of a decision point. And within the context of what I mentioned as cell-free DNA, this is in your blood, you can find traces of DNA from dead cells. And those can often, if you look at them, if you take them and you sequence them, you can find basically whether you had tumor cells. And this is a field that's really been moving very quickly forward, allowing us to start detecting and screening for cancer from blood samples.
So is it that those DNA fragments somehow have the signature of cancer, or is it just that those DNA fragments somehow are the result of some sort of cancer biochemistry?
Oh, those DNA, that DNA is basically coming from dead tumor cells.
Right.
And, they basically, they get, ultimately, some of them die, they get lysed, and you see, you can just pick up in your blood this floating DNA that you can identify through a variety of different means that it came from a tumor.
Sure.
And that's a big change.
Well, Shai, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. I wish you very best of luck, both with CytoReason and with your department, the Technion. So thank you so much for coming on. It's been really a fascinating discussion.
Thank you, Felix. If I can I add one line here someplace, or
you can add whatever you like. Please do. Go on.
So I didn't get a chance to say. First of all, this has been a real pleasure. But to close on our main topic of academia and industry, one place where I think we've been making those changes at the Technion has been with what we call the Zimmern Institute, which is basically about facilitating chaperoning academics in early stages so that ahead of time they think about what is going to happen in industry and facilitating that connection makes happen. And so if you ask me, going back to your question about how is industry changing, how is the relationship between academia and industry changing, it basically needs to get so tight that you don't lose really good academic research in the midway, in the middle, so that patents lie in the patent office and never make anything of use, but rather everything that academics do that is of relevance gets commercialized and makes an impact in the real world. And I think that's the world we want to see: high efficiency in academia to industry transition.
Shai, thank you so much again. It's been an absolute pleasure. Cheers.
Thank you. All
right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Ping me on LinkedIn if you have any ideas on new subjects or guests.